Mr. Henderson, thank you for joining us on Mediabox. So you are a Deputy Director of Frontline Defenders, which is the International Foundation for the Protection of the Human Rights Defenders in Dublin. So let's start with the definition of the human rights defenders. Who are the human rights defenders?
Human rights defenders are all those who work peacefully to defend and promote the human rights of other people. It's a definition which is set out in the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders that was adopted in 1998, and it was adopted unanimously at the General Assembly of the United Nations. So in principle, all countries are committed to protect the space for those who stand up for, speak out on behalf of and defend the human rights of other people.
And on the occasion of the Parliamentary Assembly autumn session today, you participated in a hearing on protection and the role of the human rights defenders in Council of Europe member states. So from that point, I know that it's going to be a general question, but maybe you would like to underline the situation in European Council of Europe member states. So how do you see the situation of the protection of human rights defenders in these member states?
Well, the sad reality is that there's increasing repression against human rights defenders in a number of the member states of the Council of Europe. That's part of a global trend, but it's particularly worrying in the context of Russia, in the context of Azerbaijan, in the context also to some extent of Hungary. And we're very concerned about the Council of Europe being strong and effective in continuing to protect the human rights of people within the Council of Europe and to stand up against those repressive measures which are being brought in. We've seen in Russia a number of restrictive legislation measures, including the infamous Foreign Agents Law, which has sought to target and close down human rights organisations operating in Russia. We've seen a number of very well-respected human rights organisations, including, for example, ADC Memorial, that worked on issues around discrimination, particularly with regards to migrants in Russia, being forced to close down because of the restrictive legislation that was brought in. We've also seen physical attacks against human rights defenders in the context of the Caucasus, and we mentioned this morning the case of the Joint Mobile Group, who were physically attacked because of their ongoing human rights work in Chechnya. And in Azerbaijan, we've seen an unprecedented crackdown against human rights defenders, with a number of human rights defenders imprisoned and ill-treated in prison as well. And we're concerned both to try and secure the release of those human rights defenders and to make sure that their treatment in prison meets with international standards.
So what should have done to strengthen the protection of the human rights defenders?
What should the Council of Europe do?
Yes, and your recommendations, especially to the Parliamentary Assembly.
The Council of Europe is already doing some good work, and of course they're following issues around the rule of law and the way in which states are compliant with their obligations in terms of the European Convention on Human Rights, and they're doing good work in that regard. I think there's more that can be done, and the Parliamentary Assembly is a political body as well as a body that's following the judicial process in terms of the European Convention on Human Rights. I think needs to give a higher political profile to the issue and to speak out more forcefully about the attacks on human rights defenders in a number of Council of Europe member states. And it's partly a challenge of ideas. We have a number of authoritarian rulers who are seeking to undermine the idea of being able to speak out on behalf of human rights, to marginalise and defame and stigmatise those who defend human rights. And we need political leaders here in Europe to stand up and defend the idea of human rights more strongly.
And I think that from that point, it's also important to underline the functioning and the objectives of your foundation as well, Frontline Defenders. So what are the main activities of this foundation for the protection of the human rights defenders?
Well, we're very practically focused. So we have a security grants program, which we gave away €1 million last year in small grants for human rights defenders to put in place security measures in offices, to put in place legal and medical support for human rights defenders who've been jailed or tortured, to help human rights defenders make more secure their communications and their security of information, which can often put at risk those they're working with when they're working on behalf of victims who might be threatened because they've given testimony. And we also do training in security, including personal and organisational security and digital security, and how to manage communications and manage information. For example, we had a training just a few months ago with human rights defenders in the Ukraine who who are trying to find a way of working and documenting human rights violations and protecting victims in the context of the conflict in the east of the country, which is obviously a new context for many of them. And we brought in experts who'd been working to document human rights violations in the context of the conflicts in the Caucasus, who were able to share experiences and talk about how they could continue to do their work in spite of the very difficult environment in which they were trying to help protect victims.
Thank you for joining us, Minister Henderson.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.